Really thrilled to be sitting here with a stellar panel of very forward-thinking, creative individuals this morning to talk about or sort of explore ideas around diversity and inclusion in contemporary art. Have some wonderful guests, and I'm going to give you very, very abridged bios, although many of you know that these are incredibly impressive individuals whose work and experience span decades and continents. Thrilled to have Diana Hadid, who's a Brooklyn-based contemporary artist who creates sculptures, installations, and drawings using various media. Sanford, to my right, is a Harlem-based interdisciplinary artist who works with film and video installation, sculpture, music, and performance. And I'll get in that he's an LA native, even though he's Harlem-based. Gisela is an LA-based contemporary artist who's developed a unique vocabulary of organic minimalism, breathing lifelike qualities into reductive forms. And we also have Yvonne Villarreal, who co-founded the nonprofit Art Production Fund in 2000, and in 2014 became the founding partner of Culture Core, a company focused on art and cultural entrepreneurship. So thank you for joining us this morning. So I think it's pretty safe to say that over the past several years, there's been a lot of discussion around the topics of diversity, inclusion, and representation, not only in the art world, but I think it's safe to say, I would say that these are topics that have been engaged with some intensity and urgency as of late across our social, political, and economic landscape. And I think saying that, it's very clear that what we all know as the art world, and I generally like to speak in pluralities, art worlds, because I think LA and New York, although it makes up the art world, are very, very different landscapes, Miami and so on. But I think it's safe to say that what we've come to know as the art world is really a microcosm of the macro. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. And so just as our world, right at this moment, contends with the ongoing and often very urgent challenges of diversity, inclusion, representation, I think we are contending in the art world with many of these same questions. For example, what do we mean exactly by inclusion and diversity, right? They're buzzwords, but what do they actually mean? What can we as art professionals, gallerists, collectors, and curators do to further expand the field? What kinds of roles, if any, should, actually that's not a favorite word of mine, may artists play in the expansion of our thinking and of the field more broadly, right? I think in general when we have these conversations, and I've done hundreds of panels over the past few years, we don't necessarily have these conversations with artists, right? Which is really sort of exciting for me today. And then finally, do we need to think about creating new models, new institutions and organizations? And if so, what do these models look like? And I say that because we're talking about inclusion. Are we talking about inclusion in the very institutions and structures that in many ways, not all, but in many cases, historically were predicated on the exclusion of individuals, either based on gender or race or class, and other categories of social difference. So lucky for us, all of you are here, and all four of you have all the answers to get us on the right path, and maybe even bring about world peace in the process. So we're good. No pressure, but really, what I thought I would do is start with a few key points from the study that I shared with all of you last week. So sidebar, we have had conversations and many sort of dress rehearsals talking about some of these issues amongst the five of us. And this is an interesting study, and many of you may know it, came out of City University in 2016. And the study surveyed 1,300 artists represented by New York's top 45 galleries. So it's a very sort of New York-centric study, but I think still worth kind of noting some of the findings. They found that 80.5% of artists represented by the galleries are white. 68% of artists represented by galleries are male. And remember, this is 2016. 32% of artists represented by galleries are female. And I thought this last point, I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but I thought it was sort of interesting. 20% of the artists graduated from Yale. Interesting. So using this as a jumping off point, I thought I would start with the artists, and then I want to kind of ask Yvonne some very pointed questions, because she works in a very unique space across the public and private sector with creating works with artists in non-traditional spaces. So I wanted to start off by asking the artists, does this information come as a bit of a surprise or not? And then also if you could share briefly, what was your introduction to the art world? And specifically, can you locate the events, the people, the experiences that made you feel as though you could not only exist within the art world, but very much thrive? Who wants to take that? Yeah?
Sure.
Gisela.
Hi, everybody. So, my introduction to the art world was through an older generation artist called Dwayne Valentine. And I was so grateful for that. This whole concept of mentorship has been lost over, the years, and I think it's very paramount and important that the older generation reach out to the younger artists and, lend them a hand. And it's not in terms of dialogue, in terms of connecting with the work, and that historical lineage needs to be opened up. So I think the number one thing that I would say as an action point that needs to be taken is the curating, the curators, the institutions. I think that's where it starts. And curating exhibitions that break open the art canon. There's this historical art canon, and the genre that I love is minimalism, so I can talk about that. You have Judd, and you have Flavin, and you have all the light and space guys, and it's basically as white, male, straight as you can get in the historical art canon. And I believe in the disruption of that, and to say, you can curate shows that across time, and break open the conversation and say, who is working in some kind of new minimalism today? Alicia Quad, for example, Neri Batramian. These are female artists that have taken some of the vocabulary of minimalism and incorporated it into their practices today. They might not label themselves that, which is a whole other thing about labeling, but just breaking open that canon and curating shows that has younger generations, different genders, female. If I see another show with a Donald Judd stack and a Dan Flavin light thing and no women around, I'm just going to freak out, even though I love that work. What about Judy Chicago? Judy Chicago did the most amazing minimal work in the 60s, and it was lost. They don't put her next to Judd. She belongs there. She was in that conversation. And also, Yayoi Kusama. When was the last time that anybody picked up Donald Judd's 1964 essay called Specific Objects and read it? Everybody has these critics that have basically set the canons in cement for 50 years, and nobody's gone back and actually read the writings of some of these artists. He put Yayoi Kusama in his list of specific objects, specifically her accumulation series, in which she did the boat with all of the phallic forms, because he said a repetitive and kind of obsessive pursuit of a single interest constituted a specific object. So why not curate a show with these women thrown in with the men, and then go and add some of the younger generation artists? So that would be my takeaway, is to make a difference in curating, and it starts at the institutional level, and then collectors will follow. See, I think that's where it begins.
Great, thank you, and I really love this point. And at the end of any conversation that I do, I'm really interested in action points, right? We've heard things, now what? What do we do? So I love the point about mentorship. I think that's incredibly important across the board, and that can start both in and outside of the context of the institution.
My introduction to the art world was probably the cartoons that my fourth grade teacher made when I was in school. I didn't have an introduction to the art world until, maybe grad school, in terms of what we're talking about when we talk about the art world. I didn't know that this world existed. So just to give you some background, I was born in Syria and we moved to Ohio, and my family's always been very artistic, could draw. All the women in my family do some kind of art or craft in a very kind of committed way. So there's a tradition, at least for me personally, of valuing kind of a certain dedication to, making. And And if they had been born in America, I'm positive that they would have run laps around where I am now. You know, if my grandma had been here, my mom, I think, you know, you would know her name. But I mean, for me, I guess, what was the second part of that question?
The second part really was, what was there a particular, I mean, Gisela mentioned mentorship, right? And kind of identifying an individual that kind of served as sort of a guiding light or sort of a, you know, space clearing gesture.
So
right?
yeah, I mean, I had when I went to college, finally, I had a few good teachers, and I was an art history major, and I was, growing up in Ohio, was lucky in that I was an hour from Cleveland, 2 hours from Pittsburgh, 2 hours from Columbus, and they had these fantastic biennials, and something turned on in my brain. Like, I saw the Carnegie International when I was in undergrad, and I was like, oh, I had no idea you could make work like Sarah Z, or, you know, you can make work like that was definitely a shatter point for me. But of course, I was also looking at art history, and that also was a constant feat. You know, I now most of my work has some connection to some minor artifact in art history, or some major artifact in art history, or some object, or some painting, or something. So yeah, I mean, it was just because my ears were open, and I went to college, and I was like, well, I like art, I draw every day, all the time, so I should be an art major, I should just keep doing this. But I didn't, like, this is the thing, when you grow up in a certain world, a certain class, a certain culture, you don't know that. You don't know what contemporary art is. And that's the majority of America, honestly. Most Americans don't know what contemporary art looks like. They go as far as Warhol. And speaking of mentorship, I think that's, I mean, I guess that's where that starts, but it's hard, and in part probably because of exactly this issue of inclusion. I think people don't see themselves, most Americans have a hard time seeing themselves represented in the art world, or the art, you know, so it's kind of, it's hard to engage. I was thinking about this really, to give you a sense, I guess, of maybe what I'm thinking about in other terms. This is going to be weird, but I was listening to this radio show, and there was this woman who had just written a book about the kind of aesthetic bias that liberals have when they hear country music, and I found it so interesting because, so she brought up a musician. I'm sorry, it's a little off topic, but it's not totally off topic, but a musician who, a country music singer from like the 60s, who was kind of doing really progressive, you know, songwriting. Like, he was kind of defending, you know, all these ruffians who would end up in jail and have, you know, lovers, you know, and so he was like a champion, sort of a quiet champion for gay rights, you know, early on. And I didn't know that, I missed that, and I started listening to him, got obsessed. And so for me, I think it's about trying to experience an aesthetic experience that's uncomfortable, that you might not immediately like, you know, because a lot of, you know, growing up as Arabic, in an Arabic household, Middle Eastern household, the world around me was ornament, was gold, and you know, we aren't wealthy by any stretch, you know, so, but this was just, my mother's appreciation of art was ornate, and what I was learning from my professors in college was that wasn't high art, right? Like, we're at minimalism, and we're at, you know, which is, you know, I love minimalism, but they were only thinking of this kind of that can, yeah, right, and it's insane because Western art history is rooted in the Baroque and the ornate, right? But there was this point when there was this kind of separation, and it has implications. So I think what's really important as an audience, if you're not a curator, is to think about what visual vocabulary is not familiar to me that I might learn something from? What country music song maybe can I get into? Like, you know, you may not, again, like, it's so weird.
No, but I think that makes perfect sense, and I think to go back to the discussion even around the canon, you know, I think in so many ways we take, especially outside of academia, I mean, in the classroom, I'm constantly disrupting and exploding the canon, right? It's old and inflexible and slow to change, but outside of the classroom and within the context of the broader art world, in many ways, I think we sort of take it at face value. Oh, what genre do you work in? Sculpture? Installation? I mean, I remember a time when photography, throughout my graduate school career, it was still being argued as to whether or not photography had a sort of rightful place within the sort of fine art context. So I'll get back to it in terms of an action point. Just this idea of the canon and how much of what we love in terms of what we do, we see, we consume visually is actually based within the canon. And that's an interesting thought. Let me pass it on to Mr. Biggers.
So I guess my first exposure to art and then contemporary art started at a very young age. I grew up in Los Angeles, and around my home there were pictures of what is now considered black romantic art, but we're talking artists like Charles White, Elizabeth Catlett, and I also was very fortunate that my cousin John Biggers was a known artist and painter and muralist in, you know, largely the South, but, you know, across the nation. So to twist that a little bit, my father is a neurosurgeon, and he was the first black neurosurgeon in California. So at a certain point when I got into art, and I was like, maybe this is something I can do. And most parents would be like, there's no way you can make a living doing that, right? But then I had to consider my father becoming a neurosurgeon through the Jim Crow South, and I realized that me becoming an artist was actually not that difficult. He basically was trying to be an astronaut. I just wanted to make some paintings. So, and luckily because of his approach to his career, he was actually open to me becoming an artist because, you know, back in those days to become a doctor, you were basically studying Renaissance, quote unquote, Renaissance men. So people who were reading philosophy and doing art and science and so on, the Michelangelos, the Da Vinci's. So in his romantic mind, he's like, son, if you do that, that's great, but you have to go with the same discipline and fervor that you would if you wanted to be a physicist. So that was the basic underlying tone. But the work that I was literally exposed to was very much these paintings and sculptures that represented alternative views of the black experience in America. The things you would not see in the media, you would not see on the news. This was alternative information for us, basically. So my understanding of art at that point was largely from an educational and informative standpoint. And it wasn't until I got out of college, and while I was in college, I developed an exchange program through my school, which was Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. My man. And I went to Florence, Italy for my junior year, and while I was there, of course, I was studying all the classic Italian advents of various forms of art and so on. So that was very much in the canon. Long after that, I went to Japan and lived there for a few years, and that changed my aesthetic completely. Then I went to grad school, and that deconstructed everything. So I was going into this whole postmodernism and thinking about breaking down everything. So I really understand what you're saying about listening to country music, because the themes are the same as the themes in rap music, actually. So it's really, there's a lot of convergence to these forms. In all music, exactly. So I started to get really interested in how I could break down everything. No longer was I just interested in minimalism or Baroque or classics or any of that. I wanted to just mash them all up and see what came out of it next. So I think that's sort of where I got my approach, and my permission, I guess, to become an artist became from, you know, watching what my family did, but also sort of seeing culture move in a certain way. So there was a second part of the question.
No, that was it. Really just sort of and I think we all aren't surprised by the kind of the stats, the data, you know, in that study, but really just sort of given that, and that's coming out of 2016, how did you then kind of see yourself within this space? And you've answered that question. So, and I want to come back to this idea, because I think all three of you as artists are really touching on the notion of rewriting, creating counter narratives, right? Understanding that there is a sort of standard or default narrative, and sort of how do we create counter narratives. I love the idea of disruption. I want to actually move to Yvonne, because as I said earlier, Yvonne occupies a very unique space. She's sort of worked across the public and private sectors with artists in a very deep way to create work in what I think it's safe to call non-traditional spaces. And one of the things that Yvonne and I discussed earlier was the element of audience. And I noticed that all three of you actually mentioned the idea of audience, right? I mean, artists make work to be seen, not to shove in the back of a closet. So audience is I think first, top of mind for most artists. Not that you're creating work for them, but you understand that it is going to be received, consumed, critiqued, praised, and so on and so forth. So Yvonne and I were talking about this idea of audience, and I'm wondering, Yvonne, if you can share your thoughts on this idea around public engagement, the strong focus that you always place and kind of always keep in mind around audience, and how that kind of plays a role in inclusion, or sort of expanding the conversation.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for being here. God, this is such a big question. So I'm just going to start in 1998. It's really hard for me to not talk about the 10 years before that. But in 98, I did, before our production fund, my first artist production. So I asked Vanessa B. Croft, can I help you produce your fantasy performance? I thought she was always having a hard time getting what she wanted to do her performances. And she said yes. That was in 96. And in 98, it turned into us borrowing Guggenheim for the night and doing a performance called Show. And 1,500 people came, and it was free and open to the public, and it was really intense to produce it. But it created a platform that was thrilling for me, and thrilling and important for her, a major new platform for her. It was on the cover of Art Forum, and it shaped out this idea of, reinvigorated the idea of feminism. People were really angry, and some people totally embraced it. It was really radical, and then I realized there was a niche, this kind of chartered niche of art producer. So my dear friend Doreen Remen, she and I started our production fund in 2000. We founded our production fund. And the idea is that we would produce ambitious projects by artists and get them out there into the world. It would be an artist-focused, artist-centric projects, and where do they need to live in order to have the most impact. So I'll cut right to one of our first major projects that I feel was beyond successful in dealing with an open expansion of an audience, and where the socio-economical situation is so different, and like the Elm Green and Drag set, okay, Danish, one's from Denmark, one's from Norway, gay artists, they often make work about their sexual identity, their gender, and they came with this proposal. We were in the middle of doing Rudy Stingle at Grand Central Station, doing wall-to-wall carpet. We weren't going to take on another project. Our thing was like we would do one project, finish it, and then move on to the next, because they were two of us working. And so they came with this idea of Proto-Marfa, and it was too beautiful to pass up. We saw that, we knew at this point, these kind of projects will not come to us every day, and they don't. So we got, my husband is Mexican-American artist who grew up on the border, and his family has a ranch in Marfa, and we were lucky enough to get a nice piece of land on a neighboring ranch right on Highway 90. And the artist's idea was they would make this small-size boutique, small-scale boutique, but the door is shut, you can't get in. A time capsule, and so this is 2005. So it looks like a minimalist Judd sculpture from the outside, this masculine machine-made Adobe cube. And then when you go up, there are 40 pairs of shoes and handbags that were donated from the Prada Foundation. They didn't want any money from Prada for this, nor did they want to give us money, so that worked out fine. But the shoes, which you might not know, nor is it written about, are the size that a drag queen could wear. They're size like 11. So that's their little joke. That's their little infiltration. But it's there for knowledge if you want to go further. The people that see this are ranchers, truck drivers. There's always an 18-wheeler pulled over. At face value, the piece is about, it's funny, but it's not a one-liner. It's about the idea of wanting something, desire, but you can't get it. It's dysfunctional in that location, because why would you even want these shoes? Because there's snakes and tarantulas and scorpions that bite you, and it's dysfunctional. So it's about this idea of displacement and art being displaced. And so it's inclusive. It started, people loved it, people hated it, they spray painted it, they destroyed it. It's gotten probably 50 acts of iconoclasm over the years. Right now we're having to repaint it. But it's become now, we've had a fight for it to stay, and now it's a museum. It is a museum status. So I think this is about inclusion, broadening the audience. If you don't broaden the audience and inclusiveness of the audience, you can't broaden the arts world statistics. They'll stay the same.
I mean, the audience really does have power. And speaking of power, I want to just thank you so much, Yvonne, because that was really, I actually did not know.
And that's like one history. That's 20 projects I want to talk
right,
about.
And I have a couple that I definitely want to come back to. But just to ask all of you, and maybe starting again with the artists, in terms of this discussion around representation and inclusion, how do you see yourself sort of either explicitly or implicitly, or even not really playing a role? I know, Diana, when you and I originally talked about doing this panel, you gave it some thought and you thought, well, you know, I'm an artist. Of course there should be more women and, you know, black and brown people and Muslim and immigrant artists, but I'm making my work. Fair enough. I happen to believe as a curator that artists are not sort of, they don't play a passive role. I think they work both implicit and explicitly in engaging. And of course, you know, all of you were sort of hand-selected because there is an awareness and a consciousness. But I think that they do play a role. And so I'm wondering, and maybe I'm imposing my thought, but I would love to hear from all of you, as well as you, Yvonne, as how you see yourself playing a role, or is it perhaps not your business? Is it perhaps, you know, does it fall on the curator, the institution, or the gallerists, or, you know, the and I'm complicit in this, the professors that either do or don't teach the canon? You want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, the artist's role is just so important. And speaking of experience, like you say, country music, what art really is, why we're all here today, sitting here, is because we're looking for that experience that our daily life doesn't give us. We're trying to broaden our horizon, our view of the world. And the artist's role is to be like the village shaman, you know, somebody who can connect you to the other side. So when I look at the art world, I say you want the broadest possible experience so that you, as the viewer, as the collector, the participant, can access all those different points of view of the shaman, the seer, the oracle. Like if you look back in time, you're talking about the Renaissance, you know, there were always visionaries that people would go to seek knowledge and to seek that special something, you know, answers to questions about the universe. And when I look at us, I see us all on this blue ball floating in space. I see us as a universal experience. We're all in this together. And so the art world has been so insular before. So now when you add the broadening of the experience of all different kinds of humans, I see us all as what joins us together as our humanity. And that includes, you know, every color, every gender, every race, and so every nationality, so curating across countries. You know, that what the artist's role is to bring that special, mysterious answers to us as humans. And so the broader the better, because then you can cover the broad, full spectrum of our humanity.
My experience, in addition to making work in the US, I've done several residencies all over the world, so including living in Japan for 3 years and most recently in Rome for a year. And part of that is I do consider artists to be ambassadors of a sort too. So as we're out, it's one thing to make the work here in the US and show it in the US, which is part of the conversation, but also to then show that work outside of the US to show alternative views of how even Americans think. And once again, it goes into the much larger rubric of contemporary art, which I think should allow many people to come in and bring many points of view and hopefully have conversations that expand everybody who's been touched by that work. But when I first moved to New York, I started doing projects that were based on my trip to Japan. I was making these hand-cut floor-based mandala pieces, these large mandalas. And they were made out of floor tiles, so I was able to transport them, and I would take them to the Bronx, and I would lay them down at these breakdancing contests, so that breakdancers from the neighborhood would come and dance on this mandala, which to them they thought was just an ornate stage for them to perform on. But I hid a video camera above that shot, that captured the whole performance on the floor. So you have circular mandalas with breakdancers doing circular moves. And then I later showed those pieces down at PS1 and various museums around the world at this point, and it showed the documentation by showing these dancers. So when I let the dancers know, I started inviting them to the openings. So you have a downtown opening, which is usually, at that point, this is late 90s, we're pretty monochromatic, if you know what I mean. So you have one demographic in there watching, and then all of a sudden you have all these black and brown kids from the Bronx coming in there and seeing themselves on the video. So now they are inside the white cube, which was a huge thing, but now you also have the convergence of the audiences. And you see them talking and hanging out, and it's like, this would have never happened if this dance floor, this communal place wasn't here. So that was my early ways of trying to do some type of, what's the word I'm looking for, infiltration, basically, and to introduce different demographics, not only to the work, but to each other. And it's something that I've tried to do in several projects since, but even on a more formal level, if I have a museum show and I need writers for the catalog, I make sure to find young, black, brown, female, queer artists to write about my work, because not only I'm interested in how they see my work, but also that their voice be in the document, in the newly emerging canon, speaking about the work, because I don't want to just preach to the choir. I want various voices to add their opinions and their experiences into the work as well.
Yeah, so both of those points are really when an artist has achieved some power or some agency where they can be an ambassador and they can, bring a more humanity connection around the world. But what I think is interesting, and I aspire to be that person, but the truth is, in my head, is that that's not, that wasn't something that was communicated to me when I was younger. We're still humans, so there's this idea that an artist can go and solve the world's problems. And I do think incrementally everyone doing good is helping to solve the world's problems. But inside, we're just working to figure out what our interesting problems are, right? I don't come to the studio, and I don't think either of you guys do, with this okay, I'm gonna fix this. You know what I mean? I think ultimately, yes, that's the deeper thing. But it's hard to get there if you don't know, if you're not kind of just being very careful to follow your own instincts, right? Because there's a lot of expectation. When I was in college, I was, my first sculpture class, I was 17, and already my teachers knew my last name, and they were showing me this very politicized work and kind of saying, well, as an Arab, how do you feel about it? I'm like, what? I'm an Arab? I'm not thinking about, I'm used to my biography, right? I'm used to the fact that I'm a woman, I'm used to the fact that I was raised this way or that, and I resented the expectation that I should be a spokesperson at the age of 17, right? So, and it's accumulated to the point where, look, it's especially tricky for me because I present like a white girl, right? But I have this, I'm light skinned, right? So that's a set of privileges. But I have this experience at home that's very, very different, radically different. And for me, my work, I think, really brings the minimalists that I love, that I grew up with, learning about, and everything else inside me that wants to retaliate against that. Or, you know what I mean? So there's always a little contradiction in terms of the public and the private for an artist. And I had a lucky run, I've had a lucky run so far. Like I have, some publicity. I think the first time that I realized how specific my demographic was when Saatchi bought my work and put me in a show called Unveiled, New Art from the Middle East. So I'm from Ohio, like in my I mean, I am, but I felt awkward being a part, for a moment when I heard about it, I thought, well, like I've never met these people, I don't understand the community that they're talking. I was 26, so I didn't understand kind of the really unusual demographic. I mean, I did because I lived it, but I didn't see it in such plain black and white terms, where suddenly I was an Arab artist making work about fallen towers in New York. So I'm like, what? Like, I didn't know I was doing that. It's like this weird. So you see I don't know, there's, but I've come to appreciate my very peculiar, I think, demographic. There aren't a lot of women who grew up in Ohio, who were born in Syria, who are making a large scale of sculptures. So I appreciate that. And now in my later years, I'm more acquiesced to kind of coming to these things and making it known what I look like and how I am and what my influences are, and then I'm also from Ohio. And I think that my work doesn't initially read as anything political, right? But I am my work too. So the work that I make is it's always political, right? Because it's political that I'm making it. Right? So there's so much complication, is my point.
It's really multi-layered. It's really multi-layered. I think in addition to, I think a lot of what you're speaking about is this notion of the burden of representation, right? So as a black, male, cisgendered, Harlem-based artist, or as a black,
Wait, just interrupt you for a second. Just to point out that in the press release I was mentioned as a black American artist. And, as an artist, I'm just an artist. I'm an American artist. I think you can figure the rest out if you meet me.
Right.
But once again, there are times when I might say I'm a black artist because I'm thinking of the politics of the 70s when there was no representation for black people. So it is a double-edged sword. But I think the point being that it is way more complex than a binary of us being, our work being equal to our political standpoint.
Right.
And I'd like to talk about this in terms of labeling, because I've experienced it too. Just like Sam Gillian was making amazing color-filled abstract work, and he wasn't supposed to be doing that. So that's why he just fell off the radar. Well, you are supposed to be making this kind of work. So I, as a Latina woman, I'm not supposed to be making minimalism, period. You're supposed to be making some form of political, either Chicano, if you live in LA, art. And just like you said, my art is radical because I'm a woman tackling minimalism, and that's just in and of itself a statement that the work itself doesn't have to say it, but it exists by virtue of its existence. It's tackling that. Right. So the labeling, the takeaway, Isolde, because you love the takeaway, is basically don't necessarily subscribe to the labels that are placed on you. You own the meaning of your work, at least until you die, and then you're screwed. But up until you die, you can talk about your work, and you could say, this is how I see myself in the context of where I'm at, and this is what my work means, Right.
And I think that's a really good point. So the burden of representation, the labels, and I think what I'm hearing from all three of you as artists too is, consistently being confronted with these moments where you kind of buck those labels. I think now is that you've kind of had some time to sort of simmer on all of this, Diana and others, we're also more aware of the conversations, right, and the nuances that are going on than we were when we were 17. I also think just in terms of, to go back to the sort of canon, or there being this notion of a sort of standard, or kind of a default culture, right, or a default kind of art. I think that's really important. And I think, Yvonne, in terms of what you're doing, as sort of a disrupt, and I don't know if you think of it in this way either, but as sort of a disruptive strategy, but also kind of an intervention in working with artists who may not have had the chance. Vanessa Beecroft was a perfect example, I think, who may not, women don't typically get those massive, large-scale either museum, but also in particular massive, large-scale public commissions. But working with artists who are sort of underrepresented or whose voices haven't been amplified, and then moving it out of the institutional space. And it's not at all, I don't say that in a pejorative sense, right? There's nothing against museums. I came up, through museums, but moving it out into that space, right? Yeah. I think, can you talk a little bit about, does that allow for a greater freedom on the part of the artist? Does that maybe allow a space in which you would sort of, you're better able to kind of defy certain sort of labels or constrictions? And then again, your audiences. I mean, so many of your audiences are in a way accidental. They're not even coming to those spaces specifically to experience art at first.
I love galleries, museums too. We've worked a lot with them. They need to be more expansive and more inclusive, but without a doubt. But we need to work smarter and expand that. And how do we do that? One of the ways that we do it is just to get art into spaces, public spaces and privately owned spaces that are highly public. That's a really great way to work, because then you can also get support from companies perhaps who own those spaces and not have to just spend so much time fundraising, which I did for 17 years, and now our wonderful director Casey Fremont is fundraising. I'm still helping with that, but quieter. So it's been such an interesting journey. Just to think about the different spaces. So some spaces, like we did this one infiltration with Christian Holstead in a McDonald's. He made a sculpture of a jukebox, and we put it in McDonald's in West Village. And they said yes, and it was just this fabulous moment of a week of this artwork in there. So that's kind of small scale, but it made an impact. With Caleb Lindsay of the first Prospect One, we produced a performance of his, but we didn't put it in an art space. We put it in the oldest jazz club in New Orleans, and we had his collaborators were the jazz musicians, and there he comes out in drag and singing. That was astounding. We could have had it running up until now, and it would still be a sold-out audience. It was crazy popular. And then within more like privately owned spaces, we've had the pleasure of working with Isolde at Westfield, doing an ongoing video series, and we've presented work by Marilyn Minter, Rashad Newsom, and
Alex Prager.
And Alex Prager. Amazing 3 projects, and now here in West Palm, in the consulting work I'm doing through Culture Corps, one of my clients is related, and we took over. They've hired us to help develop cultural programming, and they're very related. Is a great company because they really believe in artists. So we took over the old Macy's in City Place and have done a big commission with Michael Craig Martin, his first public and largest public scale work in the United States, the world. He did the whole outside, and then the inside, upstairs, a sound piece by Stephen Vitiello, and then downstairs is a growing group exhibition called Assemblage. And what's really interesting is that now we're opening it. I hope you'll all come. What's really interesting, and the kind of dangers of also working in unexpected, unprotected places like a museum would offer, is the incidents, the unexpected incidents that can happen. It's not a controlled situation. So, like about 4 months ago, they rented out half of the space because they're supporting this whole arts program, and it's free, open to the public. But next door, our neighbor became the Downton Abbey experience. So I'm like, wow, I didn't tell the artists when we invited them that Downton Abbey was going to be our neighbor. That could be a problem. But then we're like, okay, well, we'll get a separated wall. We'll get to negotiate a little bit for a division. And then the pro of that situation is that this season, hundreds and thousands of people will go to see the Downton Abbey. And this is a demographic of people that are not going to go see a Glenn Kino spinning chair, or a Candy Chang Before I Die piece. So this is exciting. And it really is amazing to see a totally new group of people looking at this art. So it comes with its difficulties, but it's, I think it turns a lot of people on besides me and Doreen and Casey as producers. it also turns people on, it makes them think, and it helps to create a higher level of consciousness, a collective consciousness, a place where people gather and create community around it, and it inspires them and gives them empowerment to become creative.
Yeah, clearly there's more than one way to cross the finish line. I mean, I think we're a ways out from whatever finish line that may be, but just in terms of even thinking about different models, right, that are not tied to some of the historical constraints, I think, that a lot of us have talked about. I mean, that's a wonderful one. I mean, even this weekend, as Franklin said last night, in terms of gathering community, beginning to build community, and really kind of creating greater awareness around the sort of currency that culture can have, I think is really important. So I'm very mindful of time. I want to do not a lightning round, but I want each of you, because all of you know me very well, and I'm very, look at Sanford's already smirking. I'm very tactical, so I always like to leave with like one little tactical kind of action point from each of you in a nutshell, and then I would like to open it up to the audience for a few questions, should you have them. So. Gisela, you mentioned mentorship.
Yes.
Did you want to?
Well, mentorship is very important, and also as artists, I believe that artists should collect if they can, and support other artists by collecting. And some people say, oh, well, I don't have the money, but you can make ways, and you can add that to your conversation. And I would end with just hashtag believe you. It's, in addition to believe her, believe you. As an artist, you just have to believe in yourself, and that will take you, just keep on working. Don't give up.
Great.
And this is my hope for what everyone else does.
It's your takeaway. Since we've now hashed through just what I would say the tip of the iceberg, if these lovely individuals in the audience want to take away and say, now what? What may I do? Can I do what I think about?
Keep coming to these things. That's what I mean. You
Show
can
up.
do what you can do. Show up. Yeah.
Show up.
Support, buy, or just tell someone, or just give a show, or whatever you can do. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I would actually add to that and say engage. If you're in the gallery or the museum or a public piece, speak to the people who are right next to you looking at the same piece. See what you learn from them, see what you can teach them. Art is a conversation. Engage in the conversation. That's the most active thing and the easiest thing you can do, and probably the most rewarding.
I would say there's a real hunger for creativity in our world right now. We never needed it more. And instead of being so critical about, oh, do I like this? Do I not like this? Or, a lot of like judgment. Forget all that. Embrace all levels of creativity, from, the art world as we know it, to the Sunday painter, to the art at Burning Man. And it is art at Burning Man, by the way. Some critics say it's not. And it also is a very inclusive place. There are multiple art worlds happening. Multiple. The plural is correct. I think our art world's kind of scared shitless about it. Some of the professional power players that maybe is because they don't know that other art worlds, creative worlds. So embrace it all, love it. We need more creativity, period.
Great. Thank you all so much. I want to open it up to our audience. Are there any questions? Yes, Sarah.
What does it mean to have this conversation here in a place that maybe is kind of, to my mind, less inclusive, and why have this conversation here now?
Great question. Great question. Do any of you want to?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly where we should be having the conversation. You guys are a very powerful audience, right?
Yeah.
Where else are we supposed to be?
Yeah. I mean, at a certain point, there's all this talk right now of sort of living in bubbles, right? And I'm quite happy at home in my New York bubble, but I think the only way to burst, to intervene, to disrupt, to expand, to collaborate, to include, to engage, is to step outside of that. And while it's very comforting and at times calming and edifying to sort of preach to the choir, I think where it really gets interesting and where it's really important is to get comfortable with discomfort. And you do that by stepping outside of your bubble.
And I'd like to add there are a lot of doers here, major doers, right here in this audience. I've been looking around at a bunch of doers. The Perrys, freaking Beth DeWoody, the major doer of the art world, the Shakers, Eric Shiner, Alexander. I mean, I could go on, point out every one of you. this is an interesting place because yes, it is in a way the doers are infiltrating the system because we do have also our president here. That's pretty interesting. That's why we're all here.
Oh, right. I was like, I'm sorry.
I had a brief moment of
New conversation.
do we have another question? No? Oh, Anne?
One suggestion as far as an action one could take, there are several organizations or boards that I'm involved with, and I've encouraged having one of the 3, perhaps 4 meetings down here. And I've already done it a couple of times, and I have more coming, and they come and meet collectors, and they go to the Norton, and they have little panels like this, all about inclusivity and expanding one's comfort zone.
That's great. Yeah, we'll travel.
You mentioned this study from 2016. What did it say about the market, and what are you doing to change the market for artists so that people are more aware of their value, their worth, to help them, make more money with their work than they are currently?
So you have me really shuffling through my notes. You get that question. This was less focused on the market and more focused on really a study that generated data from artists' perspectives, and it was by no means, I'm sure, that there was a margin of error in some way or another. So that's just one sort of sidebar on the study. In terms of what we as individuals think about the market or are doing about the market, you said to kind of...
Well, how could, in what way might all of us work, I guess, to change the discussion about who matters in terms of buying the work or collecting the work?
Well, I think that everything is very interconnected. It really is an ecosystem, and I think that the institutions and the curators are very important, but also the galleries, because look, we're all here together and we're all from different aspects and walks of that ecosystem. So I think it's really a symbiotic give and take. So gallery shows the work, a collector purchases the work, and that validates it. By the same token, the institution shows it, so it's all really interconnected, and it's just a matter of continuing to work and continuing to show the work, and the collectors purchasing the work, and it's kind of an upward spiral of progression over time that will determine that. So it's really the market. There's no flash snap way of getting artist prices up or more money. It's just a long haul, and you have to be in it for different reasons than the money, because as we know, that just comes and goes. It's fluctuating, so it has to be a long-term view.
And also, I think there's a camaraderie amongst artists. I could speak very personally just about this panel, and this is totally coincidental, but when I started teaching art, I met Diana. This is years ago, and we met briefly. I've always respected her work, but recently we had joined the same gallery. But I started by calling her to get advice, and then later she called me to get advice because I'm a few years older, so I have some experience in different things. She has experience in different things. We share that knowledge with each other, and we share it with other people. I've had several conversations with this one right here about introducing and educating new collectors so that they get in the game. There's a lot of black and brown people with money. They can buy art, but they don't necessarily know that because of lack of exposure and lack of understanding how that system, that ecosystem works. And we personally have vetted and talked to people that we know. It's like, you should get involved because of A, B, C, and D. So, it's all of us have to do our part, but I hear you. It's a lot about sometimes relying on the power of artists and the information that artists have to tell others.
And just another sort of note, as somebody who has worked within, I was at the Guggenheim, I was at the Bronson, who's worked within institutions, and I also teach formerly at Columbia, Vassar, and now NYU. It goes back to the canon. What are we teaching, and what kinds of statements are we making about what is and isn't good art, quote unquote, art that's worth paying attention to? What kinds of histories are we either teaching or rewriting or deconstructing? And that all feeds. I always say, and I got this little note from one of my mentors, Thelma Golden, I always say that I am complicit within this ecology, very complex ecology. The artists that I have asked my students to write about, the exhibitions that I take my students to, the exhibitions that I curate, the artists that I reach out to in the same way that Yvonne reaches out to and decides to take certain projects on, that has a very large role in creating a value system, right? We know that platforms of visibility lead to writers and critics writing about work, to collectors and curators going to see the work, to galleries going to see the artists, right? And this is all, it's, again, this really complex kind of matrix. And I think really just acknowledging your subject position, who you are vis-a-vis all of this, and what you can do to kind of intervene, right? And sort of affect change in your own little incremental way, I think is really important.
I'm sorry, one last point too. As an artist myself, and I tell other artists this, join boards. I'm on a few boards myself, the Sculpture Center, School of the Arts in Chicago. Have a seat at the table, make some decisions, influence other people who make decisions, get involved.
And also start scholarships if you can. I think scholarships, because like I went to RISD and I'm now on my president's advisory board. It's a 20% acceptance rate, but there's so few scholarships. So like my class of '88, we're working on doing a scholarship, and that would be for, it would be a very specific scholarship, and it just opened up the opportunity for more diversity right across the board. My husband went to Yale as well. There are a lot of great artists come out of Yale, by the way. Love it, but that's an interesting statistic. But he started a scholarship, and it's so touching and beautiful to see for fine art, to see the letters and the connection that he has made now with these artists that he's given a scholarship to. So I think it really, education is major.
I guess I think when you talk about money with artists, it's just it's like a scale thing. Like when you're introducing a grade school kid to art and you want them to understand the value of art, you don't talk about the price tag, I think, because that's a big deterrent. But of course, as we progress and you start to get, and even in grad school, I wouldn't, talk about the things that I talk about with Sanford to a grad student, because that can freak them out and make them think, oh, I've got to get a gallery now. They already feel that. They already feel it. Yeah, and so there's a appropriate time to do that. But I would say flood the nonprofits with money, because that's where most people kind of get their footing before they can get a gallery and they can start earning a real living and getting health care and whatever, the basics that most people enjoy. You have a job. There's a whole platform where artists just need a spot. Right, so I had 2 years of not. I'm sure you did the same kind of. There's a track that you get out of grad school and you need some nonprofits to support you. You apply for every scholarship, you apply for every grant. I used up every grant I could possibly apply for in the first 7. That's the only way. And then I was one of the lucky people that got gallery representation. Quite frankly, that's when my life stabilized. Right, but. Then that's when and I personally, I share everything with everyone, aside from my social security number and my bank account, you know what I mean? But I don't hold that information back, because it is about access. I didn't have it, so I appreciated when people told me that, but it's at appropriate levels. You don't need to talk about all of the complex ecosystem stuff to someone who's in grad school, right? But there is very little conversation at our level, because it is such a small group of people. And actually, Marianne is an awesome advocate of educating her artists about, what do you do now that you have money? You know what I mean? I ask my gallerist all the time. She's absolutely so supportive, because she knows that I didn't grow up with money. No one in my family had money, as dirt poor as you can imagine. And now I have money, and what do I do with that? I'm not just gonna buy shoes. Do you invest it? You know what I mean? Those are real long-term things, and those are conversations that people need to encourage in the art world, I think, especially with their galleries.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question. Alex?
It's a follow-up to the question about market, and it really goes to the action place. And I think that one of the, we're culturally at a moment of reckoning across the board, and this is really exciting, and us being in this location is a part of that. Want to acknowledge Sarah's both courage and vision for bringing a panel like this together and a group like this together, because this is against the grain. There would be a much bigger audience if this was a panel about Warhol and the market, or even if it was about the growing market for African American painters. This is a much different conversation, and I think we can take lesson from Sarah about how we align our actions with our values. And so the action here is, what are our values? Are we looking at the numbers? How many artworks do I own? How many are by women? How many artists do I represent? How many are artists of color? How many artists am I seeing in my graduate class? What economic classes do they come from? Because the numbers, and I really appreciate, Isolde, that you started with some statistics. These are the actual stories. Our biographies are important, but the data points are critical, and they're fluid, and they change. And this is where, what are our values? How do we take action that aligns with them?
Right.
Not a question or a call to action.
Right. So on that note, thank you so much, Alex. Yeah, I mean, really, where do we make an impact? I want to again thank Sarah for, again, like you said, Alex, her vision and sort of galvanizing and pulling this all together, along with all of the other wonderful collaborators, and above all, our 4 panelists, Yvonne, Sanford, Diana, and Gisela. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for being a wonderful audience, and hopefully it will rain and we'll all get out and see art and act.
Thank you, Isolde. Thank you.